Well, joining me from Washington, D.C., Ambassador David Mack, former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. Ambassador, thank you very much for joining us. In that report by Charles Stratford, I beg your pardon, by Steve Chow, we had a suggestion from the Syrian government that this was the work of terrorists. And it was, 2 months ago that the U.S. Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, said al-Qaeda had infiltrated the rebel groups. Do you think this is something that al-Qaeda could have done?
Well, I think your report made clear that we have a range of different groups operating, often without coordination, and there's also a range of levels of violence. There's clearly been widespread peaceful opposition to the Syrian regime, but also increasingly with desperation, you have armed opposition to the Syrian government, including defectors from the Syrian military. It's also the case that there have been infiltrators. That's been pretty well documented. There's been infiltrators from across the Iraqi border, for example, and other borders into Syria of people who may in fact be connected with al-Qaeda. So it's a range of different actors.
So by backing the Syrian rebels, in effect, the United States is forging an alliance, if you like, with al-Qaeda.
Well, the U.S. has made it very clear that it wants to see a peaceful resolution of this conflict. That's why we have worked very carefully with the Arab League and with the United Nations. We've also made it clear that we are skeptical of a lot of the claims that come from Syrian opposition elements. We're moving very, very carefully in coordination with other friends of Syria, and particularly with the Turkish government, with the Arab League, to try to determine what the actual facts are on the ground. With only 15 UN observers now in the country and with very limited international media, it's quite difficult to untangle a lot of the propaganda from the reality. Let me give a specific example, if I may, David.
Please.
Although the attacks that took place in Idlib are clearly those of people who have been themselves under fire from the Syrian government, and it can arguably be said are taking up arms to defend themselves. The rocket attacks on the Syrian central bank in Damascus would seem to fall within that spectrum that would be ordinarily considered terrorism. It's an attack upon a civilian infrastructure.
Let me ask you about indirect help from the United States ambassador for the Syrian rebels. Two specific examples that have been given some credence in the press in the last couple of weeks. One is that the United States is indirectly supplying arms, most likely through Lebanon, which is one of its biggest receivers of arms supplies anyway. And the other is that the United States is training Syrian rebels in southern Turkey. Do you think it goes as far as that?
No, I'm very skeptical about both of those reports. What we have wanted to do is to try to help organize the Syrian opposition in a political sense. But this has been proving very, very difficult. They fight among themselves. It's very difficult to tell. And the great difficulty involved in providing arms or training is that you may be providing them to elements that don't stand for the kind of things you do in terms of a transformation of political life in Syria, and moreover, they may be totally incapable of making effective use of the weapons. We have 12 years of very hard experience with the Iraqi opposition that tells us that this can be a big misplaced effort.
Ambassador David Mack, we thank you for your time on this Al Jazeera News Hour. Good to talk to you.
You're welcome.